The oldest religious texts ever written hide a secret that would change how humanity confronts death forever. Carved into pyramid walls around 2400 BCE, these ancient spells speak of a murder so devastating that it tore reality itself apart, plunging Egypt into chaos and darkness. But here's what makes this murder extraordinary. The victim didn't stay dead. This is the story of Osiris, the god-king whose death and resurrection became the blueprint for every Egyptian's hope of eternal life. His brother Seth, consumed by jealousy, didn't just kill him once. He killed him, dismembered the body into 14 pieces, and scattered them across Egypt to ensure he could never return. Yet Osiris's wife Isis, armed with nothing but love and the most powerful magic the ancient world had ever known, did the impossible. She found every piece. She reassembled what had been destroyed, and she breathed life back into death itself, conceiving a child with her resurrected husband in an act that defied every natural law. That child, Horus, would spend his entire youth in hiding, hunted by the uncle who had murdered his father. When he finally emerged to claim his throne, the resulting battle would last not months or years, but 8 decades of divine litigation, warfare, and trickery so elaborate it would make Greek myths look simple by comparison. But there's a twist buried in these ancient texts that scholars are only now beginning to understand. The murder of Osiris wasn't just mythology. It was Egypt's explanation for everything, from why the Nile floods each summer to why every pharaoh who ever ruled claimed to be the living embodiment of Horus himself. Every mummy wrapped in linen was imitating what Isis did for Osiris. Every temple ritual was reenacting this cosmic drama. Every Egyptian who died and was judged in the afterlife faced Osiris himself on his throne in the underworld, the murdered god who had become Lord of the Dead. The story you're about to hear is the foundational myth of ancient Egypt, preserved in the world's oldest religious writings and elaborated across 3,000 years of civilization. And the most shocking part? The story kept changing, kept evolving, kept revealing new layers of meaning with each retelling, as if the myth itself was alive, growing, transforming just like the god at its center who refused to stay dead. But here's what makes this story extraordinary beyond its religious significance. We can trace its evolution across millennia, watching how it changed from fragmentary references in the oldest religious texts ever written to the elaborate narrative preserved by a Greek philosopher nearly 3,000 years later. The pyramid texts, carved into royal tombs around 2400 BCE, give us tantalizing glimpses of the myth already fully formed in the Egyptian consciousness. Then come the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom papyri, and finally Plutarch's detailed account from the 1st century CE, each adding layers, complications, and meaning to a story the Egyptians never tired of telling. Tonight, let your breathing slow as we journey back to the very dawn of Egyptian civilization, to a time when gods walked the earth as kings, when magic was as real as the sun, and when death was not an ending but a transformation that required only the right words, the right rituals, and above all, the right kind of love to reverse. We'll explore not just one version of this myth, but several, examining how the story shifted and evolved, what it meant to the Egyptians who told it, and why it continues to resonate today in ways both obvious and subtle. So settle into a comfortable position. Perhaps dim the lights around you. Let the concerns of your day begin to drift away like boats on the Nile. Because the story we're about to tell takes place in a time before time was counted the way we count it now, in a land where the boundary between the human and divine was so thin you could step across it, and where a murder committed in jealousy and rage would echo through eternity, shaping how an entire civilization understood life, death, kingship, and the eternal struggle to maintain balance in an inherently chaotic universe. The story begins not with a murder, but with a birth. Or rather, 5 births. And to understand those births, we must first understand creation itself. Before the beginning, the Heliopolitan Ennead. In the beginning, according to the priests of Heliopolis, there was only none, the primordial waters of chaos, infinite and dark, without form or boundary, without consciousness or purpose, simply existing as pure potential, pure possibility, the raw material from which everything would eventually emerge. But here's something the ancient texts emphasize repeatedly, something that should unsettle us. These waters never disappeared. They remained at the edges of creation, always pressing inward, always threatening to dissolve order back into chaos. Every night when the sun set, it had to travel through these waters. Every morning when it rose, it was a victory over the possibility that everything might simply cease to exist. From these waters rose Atum, the self-created god, the first consciousness to emerge from unconsciousness, the first form to take shape from formlessness. The name Atum means the complete one, or the all, suggesting that this first god contained within himself every possibility that would later differentiate into the multitude of divine beings. He stood on the primordial mound, the first solid ground to emerge from the waters, and in that moment of standing, of being separate from the waters, creation truly began. But how Atum created the first gods reveals something profound about Egyptian thought. The sources preserve multiple versions, not because the Egyptians couldn't decide on one correct story, but because they understood that divine reality was too vast to be captured in a single telling. In some accounts, Atum masturbated, his seed producing the first divine couple. In others, he sneezed or spat them out, the very words for sneeze and spit, making puns on the names of the gods created. These weren't crude stories, but sophisticated theological statements about how multiplicity emerges from unity, how difference arises from sameness. The first 2 gods Atum created were Shu and Tefnut, typically called air and moisture, though these translations barely scratch the surface of what they represented. Shu was the space between things, the emptiness that allows things to be distinct from each other. Tefnut was the ordering principle, the structure that prevents chaos from reasserting itself. Together they embodied the basic conditions necessary for a cosmos to exist at all. Shu and Tefnut gave birth to Geb and Nut, and here the Egyptians created one of mythology's most striking reversals. While most ancient cultures imagined Father Sky and Mother Earth, Egypt made Earth male and Sky female. Nut arched over the world, her star-covered body forming the vault of heaven, while Geb lay beneath as the land itself. They loved each other with such overwhelming passion that they remained locked in eternal embrace, their bodies pressed so tightly together that nothing could exist between them, no space for life to flourish. This couldn't continue. Atum commanded Shu to separate his children, to force space between the lovers. With tremendous effort, Shu lifted Nut away from Geb, raising her up to form the sky, holding her there despite their cries of loss and longing. The Egyptians saw this drama played out every day. Geb below as the earth, Nut arching above as the sky, Shu between them as the atmosphere, forever maintaining the separation that made the world possible, but that came at the cost of the primordial lovers' union. Before their separation, Geb and Nut had conceived 5 children. But when Nut became pregnant, Ra, who had assumed the role of chief deity, grew angry. Some texts suggest he desired Nut for himself. Others hint at a prophecy warning that her children would threaten his supremacy. Whatever the reason, Ra pronounced a devastating curse. Nut would not be able to give birth on any day of the year. This created an impossible situation. The Egyptian year consisted of precisely 360 days, 12 months of 30 days each. Ra's curse covered every single day, leaving no time for Nut's delivery. Her children were trapped, unable to be born, unable to exist, caught in an eternal pregnancy that should have been impossible to resolve. But Thoth, god of wisdom and magic, found a loophole that would change everything. He challenged the moon to games of drafts and won 1/70th of her light from each day. This stolen light, gathered together, created 5 additional days that existed outside the regular calendar, belonging to no month, technically not part of the year, as Ra had defined it. These days would later be called the epagomenal days, and on these 5 days between the ending of one year and the beginning of the next, existing in liminal time itself, Nut could finally give birth. On the first day, Osiris was born, and the moment of his arrival was marked by a voice proclaiming across Egypt that a lord had been born, a great king who would rule the world. On the second day came Horus the Elder, who would later become confused and conflated with the Horus who was Osiris's son, creating one of Egyptian mythology's most complex tangles. On the third day, something went wrong. Seth didn't wait for proper birth. According to the ancient sources, he tore himself violently from his mother's womb, unable to contain himself, bursting through her side in a birth that was described as both shocking and ominous. This detail matters more than it might seem. Seth's very entry into the world was violent, chaotic, wrong. He broke the natural order before he could even take his first breath. On the fourth day came Isis, born in the Delta marshlands, her birth gentle and natural, her arrival marked by fertility and life rather than violence. On the fifth day, Nephthys emerged, whose name means Lady of the House, who would find herself caught between conflicting loyalties, between her husband Set and her sister Isis. These 5 gods, born in those days outside time, would shape everything that followed. But one detail the ancient texts emphasize should give us pause. 4 of these births were normal, natural, in accordance with Ma'at. Only one was violent, chaotic, wrong from the very start. The Egyptians, in telling this story, were making a point. Set's nature wasn't something that developed later. It was there from the beginning, written into the very manner of his birth, a warning of chaos to come. But before we come to the murder, we must understand the golden age that preceded it, the time when Osiris ruled the earth and all was well, when Ma'at, the principle of cosmic and social order, justice, truth, and harmony, held perfect sway, and Egypt knew peace and prosperity unlike anything that would come after. This was the time the Egyptians would look back to with longing, the paradise they had lost, the standard against which all subsequent rulers would be measured and found wanting. This was the reign of Osiris, when a god walked among men as their king. The golden reign of Osiris. When Geb, the earth god, grew old and weary of governing, he divided his realm between his sons. To Osiris, the eldest, went the fertile black land of Egypt, the narrow strip of dark, rich soil along the banks of the Nile, where agriculture flourished and cities grew, where life was abundant and generous. To Set, the younger son, went the Red Land, the vast deserts that stretched endlessly on either side of the Nile Valley, barren and harsh, burning under the merciless sun, home to scorpions and serpents, and occasionally to nomadic peoples who eked out a precarious existence in those inhospitable wastes. The division seemed fair in its way. Egypt needed both the Black Land and the Red Land. The fertile valley produced crops and sustained cities, but the deserts provided valuable minerals, protected Egypt from invasion by their very hostility, and represented the boundary between the ordered world and the realm of chaos beyond. But the division did not feel fair to Set. Osiris ruled over wealth and plenty, while Set ruled over emptiness and desolation. Osiris commanded a prosperous kingdom, while Set governed a wasteland. The resentment this created would fester and grow, slowly poisoning Set's heart, transforming what might have been mere envy into something far darker and more dangerous. But this was yet to come. First, there would be the Golden Age, and for a time, even Set seemed content to play his role in maintaining cosmic balance, even if that role felt secondary to his brother's glory. Osiris took as his queen his sister Isis, whose wisdom and magical power complemented his strength and authority. Their marriage represented the ideal union of king and queen, male and female, power and knowledge. Isis was not merely Osiris's consort, but his partner in every meaningful sense, advising him, supporting his work, using her formidable intelligence and supernatural abilities to help him govern wisely and well. She taught the women of Egypt how to grind grain, how to weave linen, how to brew beer from barley. She gave them the skills they needed to build civilization, to move beyond simple survival into culture and comfort and communal life. Meanwhile, Osiris gave Egypt the knowledge that would transform it from a collection of scattered tribes into a unified nation. He taught the people agriculture, showing them how to plant seeds in the rich soil left behind when the Nile's annual flood receded, how to tend crops through the growing season, how to harvest and store grain against lean times. Before Osiris, the Egyptians had been hunters and gatherers, their lives precarious and unstable, dependent on chance and the vagaries of nature. After Osiris, they became farmers, able to produce reliable surpluses that allowed population to grow, cities to form, and specialization of labor to develop. Some could farm, while others could work as craftsmen, as priests, as scribes, as soldiers, creating the complex hierarchical society that would characterize Egypt for millennia. But Osiris gave his people more than just agricultural technique. He gave them law and justice, teaching them to resolve disputes through reason rather than violence, to establish rules that applied to everyone equally, to create a social order that protected the weak from the strong and ensured that merit and righteousness were rewarded, while wickedness and selfishness were punished. He showed them how to worship the gods properly, how to build temples and perform rituals, how to approach the divine with reverence and receive in return the gods' favor and protection. He gave them music and art, teaching them to celebrate life's beauty, to create rather than merely consume, to leave the world richer than they found it. Under Osiris's rule, Egypt flourished as never before. The Nile flooded reliably each year at the right time, neither too much nor too little, depositing its burden of rich black silt across the fields. Crops grew abundantly, their yield more than sufficient to feed the people and leave surplus for storage. No one went hungry, no one lacked for the necessities of life. Justice prevailed in every village and city. The strong did not oppress the weak. The rich did not exploit the poor. Ma'at reigned supreme, that fundamental Egyptian concept encompassing cosmic order, social justice, truth, and harmony. The proper functioning of everything from the smallest human interaction to the largest movements of celestial bodies. The Egyptians would remember this time as a paradise on earth, a golden age when God and humanity lived in harmony, when the world functioned as it was meant to function, before murder and death and chaos entered to corrupt what had been perfect. They would measure every subsequent era against this standard, and find it wanting. Every pharaoh who ruled Egypt would claim to be restoring the way things were under Osiris, bringing back the Golden Age, re-establishing Ma'at after a time of disorder. The reign of Osiris became Egypt's organizing myth, its foundational narrative, the story that explained what the world should be and why it so often failed to live up to that ideal. But Osiris was not content to benefit Egypt alone. Ancient sources tell us that he traveled the world, spreading civilization wherever he went, teaching other peoples agriculture and law and the arts of peace, accompanied by music and song rather than by weapons and soldiers, conquering through persuasion rather than force. The Greeks would later identify him with their god Dionysus, another deity associated with agriculture, particularly viticulture, who traveled the world spreading his gifts and his worship. In this role as civilizer of all humanity, not just Egypt, Osiris embodied the Egyptian belief in their own cultural superiority, their conviction that they possessed the right way to live and that other peoples would benefit from adopting Egyptian customs and Egyptian wisdom. During his travels, Isis ruled Egypt in his stead, governing with such skill and justice that the kingdom prospered even in its king's absence. The ancient writers emphasize this point because it was unusual and significant. Isis was not merely keeping the throne warm until her husband returned. She was actively ruling, making decisions, administering justice, managing the state. She demonstrated that a woman could wield royal power effectively, that feminine wisdom and authority were not lesser than but complementary to masculine strength and action. This would become important later when she would have to exercise power under far more difficult circumstances, when she would have to rule not alongside a living husband but through a son who was initially too young to claim his birthright. Throughout Osiris's travels and Isis's regency, Set brooded in his desert realm, watching his brother's glory grow, seeing Osiris acclaimed as the great civilizer while he himself was feared and avoided, respected perhaps, but never loved, necessary perhaps, but never celebrated. The desert was essential to Egypt's security and economy. The desert gods, Set foremost among them, protected travelers, aided in warfare against Egypt's enemies, guarded the borders of the known world against the chaos beyond. But the Egyptians did not honor the desert the way they honored the fertile valley. They did not compose hymns praising sand and rock and scorching heat the way they praised the Nile and the black earth and the crops that grew from it. Set's resentment festered like a wound in his heart. It was not enough that he ruled the Red Land while Osiris ruled the Black Land. It was not enough that cosmic balance required both fertility and sterility, both order and chaos, both the life-giving river and the life-taking desert. Set wanted what Osiris had: the throne of Egypt, the love of the people, the glory and acclaim. He wanted to be the one celebrated in songs and honored in temples. He wanted to be the one remembered as the great king, the bringer of civilization, the establisher of Ma'at. And so he began to plan his brother's death. The murder, death by design. Set's resentment didn't explode suddenly. It built slowly, deliberately, over years of watching Osiris praised and celebrated, while he himself ruled a wasteland. The ancient texts give us glimpses of different moments when Set's hatred crystallized into murder, and these varying accounts reveal something important. The Egyptians understood that evil rarely has a single simple cause. Multiple traditions preserve multiple triggers, each containing its own truth about how jealousy transforms into violence. One pyramid text, among the oldest written sources, claims Set was taking revenge for a kick Osiris gave him, a detail so petty and inadequate to the crime that it tells us something significant. Set was making excuses, justifying an act driven by deeper resentments, with a surface grievance that couldn't possibly justify fratricide. Other sources, particularly from later periods, claim Set murdered Osiris because he discovered his brother had slept with Nephthys, Set's own wife, resulting in the birth of Anubis. This version transforms Set from pure villain into someone who has been genuinely wronged, even if his response to that wrong was catastrophically disproportionate. The truth might lie somewhere between these accounts, or perhaps in all of them simultaneously. Set felt slighted, betrayed, envious, and consumed by the simple fact that his brother ruled everything worth having, while he ruled nothing but sand and stone. The method of murder reveals Set's true nature. He didn't challenge Osiris openly, didn't face him in honorable combat, didn't give him any chance to defend himself. Instead, Set became the first murderer, the original architect of betrayal, creating a pattern that would be repeated throughout human history. The trusted family member who turns killer, the feast that becomes an execution, the gift that conceals death. According to Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE but drawing on centuries of Egyptian tradition, Set formed a conspiracy. He recruited 72 accomplices, a number that might be symbolic, might represent the 72 days of the inundation season, or might simply indicate the scope of the plot. Some accounts mention Aso, an Ethiopian queen, though her role and motivation remain mysterious in the sources we have. What becomes clear is that Set didn't act impulsively. He planned, he measured, he calculated every detail. The centerpiece of his plan was a chest, an ornate coffin-like box of exquisite beauty, decorated with precious materials that would have made it irresistible to anyone who saw it. But Set had craftsmen construct it to exact specifications. It would fit Osiris's body perfectly, and only Osiris's body, as if it had been made specifically for him. Which, of course, it had been, though no one except Set and his conspirators knew this. Set announced a great banquet and invited Osiris along with many other gods and nobles. The feast would have been magnificent, abundant with food and drink, filled with entertainment and celebration. At the height of the festivities, when everyone was relaxed and unsuspecting, Set had the beautiful chest brought in. He announced a contest, a game that would have seemed innocent, even generous. Whoever could fit inside the chest perfectly would win it as a prize. The guests took turns trying. Some were too tall, some too short, some too wide. Each attempt brought laughter and good-natured teasing. When Osiris's turn came, perhaps encouraged by the crowd, perhaps curious about this magnificent object, he lay down inside. The fit was perfect, precisely as Set had ensured it would be. In that instant, everything changed. Amast and his conspirators slammed the lid shut before Osiris could react. They nailed it closed, the sound of hammers driving nails through wood, perhaps the last thing Osiris heard. Then, in an act that demonstrates Set's determination to make death irreversible, they poured molten lead over every seam and crack, sealing it completely, ensuring that no air could enter, that no magic could penetrate, that Osiris would suffocate inside his ornate prison. They carried the chest to the Nile and threw it in, letting the current carry it away, carrying Egypt's rightful king to his death in the very river that had given the kingdom life and prosperity. The symbolism cuts deep. The Nile, source of all fertility, becomes the instrument of murder. The banquet, symbol of communal celebration, becomes the setting for treachery. The chest, which should have been a gift, becomes a coffin. Everything that should nurture and celebrate life is twisted into death's service. But Set's crime didn't end there. Different Egyptian sources, particularly those preserved in the pyramid texts and coffin texts, emphasize that Set dismembered Osiris's body after the initial murder. The number of pieces varies between traditions. 14 pieces appear in many accounts, perhaps connected to the lunar cycle or to Osiris himself as a lunar deity. 16 pieces appear in others. Some later sources claim 42 pieces, one for each of Egypt's administrative districts or nomes, suggesting that each part of Egypt received a portion of the murdered god. The dismemberment added a layer of desecration beyond simple killing. Set wasn't content with death. He wanted to ensure that resurrection would be impossible, that Osiris's body could never be reassembled, that proper burial rituals could never be performed. He scattered the pieces across the length and breadth of Egypt, from the delta in the north to the first cataract in the south, creating a geographic span so vast that recovering all the pieces should have been impossible. This is where the myth reveals something crucial about Egyptian thought. The murder happened not once, but twice. First, the suffocation in the chest, then the dismemberment and scattering. First, Set tried to make death permanent through drowning or suffocation. When that proved insufficient, he escalated to mutilation, to ensuring that even if the body were recovered, it would be in pieces too numerous and too widely distributed to ever reassemble. What happened next would determine everything. When Set murdered Osiris, he didn't just kill his brother and steal the throne. He shattered Ma'at itself, cosmic and social order, the fundamental principle that held reality together. The sources tell us that the sun hid in horror, refusing to shine on a world that had witnessed such an atrocity. The Nile ceased its annual flood at the appointed time, withholding the life-giving water and silt. Crops failed. Famine spread. Harmony collapsed into discord. Set took the throne, but his reign brought only chaos. He had won the kingship through murder, but the kingship itself couldn't function properly in the hands of someone who had violated every principle of Ma'at to obtain it. Egypt entered what the texts describe as a time of darkness and suffering, a fallen age when the golden reign of Osiris became a bitter memory of paradise lost. But the murder couldn't be the end of the story. Something the ancient Egyptians understood better than perhaps any other civilization. Death was not absolute. The boundaries between life and death were permeable. The deceased could be restored through the right rituals, the right spells, the right determination. Osiris was dead, but his wife, Isis, the greatest magician who ever lived, had not yet spoken her final word on the matter. Isis the Devoted, the search for the lost king. Isis the Devoted, the search for the lost king. Isis wasn't with Osiris when he died. The sources vary on why. Some suggest she was traveling with him on his civilizing missions. Others place her in Egypt, but away from the fatal banquet. This absence haunted everything that followed. Had she been present, with her formidable magical powers that later texts claim exceeded even Ra's in certain domains, Set's conspiracy might have failed before the chest was sealed. The god of chaos had timed his attack perfectly, waiting for the one moment when Osiris was most vulnerable. When word reached Isis of what had happened, her grief shook the foundations of reality itself. The texts describe her mourning with language so vivid it suggests the scribes themselves had witnessed such anguish. She tore her garments, disheveled her hair, beat her breast until it bruised. Her cries echoed from the delta to the cataracts, so piercing that the very cosmos trembled. Her sister Nephthys, abandoning her husband Set without hesitation, joined Isis in mourning. Together they established the pattern of ritual lamentation that would be followed at every Egyptian funeral for 3 millennia, their wailing becoming the template for professional mourners who would be hired to guide souls to the afterlife through properly performed grief. But here's what makes Isis extraordinary, what separates her from every other mourning wife in ancient mythology. She refused to let grief paralyze her. She wept and she searched simultaneously. This wasn't the passive sorrow of acceptance, but the active rage of denial, the determination that death would not have the final word. She began traveling the length of Egypt, questioning everyone about an ornate chest floating down the Nile. Most people ignored her or claimed ignorance, perhaps fearing Set's wrath. But then she found her first real clue, and it came from the most unexpected source. Children playing by the riverbank. They had seen it, the beautiful chest carried north by the current toward the delta and the sea. The Egyptians believed children possessed knowledge adults had lost, a connection to hidden truths. Whether this was divine insight, or simply the fact that children notice things others miss, their information proved accurate. The chest floated beyond Egypt entirely, across the Mediterranean, finally washing ashore at Byblos in Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. What happened next reveals something crucial about how the Egyptians understood divinity. Even dead, even sealed in a chest at the bottom of the sea, Osiris remained a god. A tamarisk tree sprouted around the chest with supernatural speed, growing in hours what should have taken decades, its trunk completely enclosing the casket. The tree grew so magnificent, so fragrant, that it caught the attention of the king and queen of Byblos, who had it cut down and installed as a pillar in their palace. Think about what this means. Osiris's body was now incorporated into foreign architecture, venerated unknowingly by people who had no idea they were harboring Egypt's murdered king. The sacred hidden in plain sight, protected by ignorance. When Isis divined through her magic where the chest had gone, she faced a delicate diplomatic problem. She couldn't simply reveal herself and demand the pillar. That would create international complications, might be seen as accusation against the Byblos royal family. So she disguised herself as an elderly servant woman, humble and unthreatening, and through calculated acts of kindness earned the queen's trust, eventually becoming nursemaid to the young princes. What she did next demonstrates the extent of her magical knowledge and her generosity even in grief. Each night, she placed the youngest prince in fire, burning away his mortality, preparing to make him immortal as a reward for his family's unknowing hospitality. This wasn't cruelty. It was the greatest gift a goddess could offer, the transformation from mortal to immortal, from temporary to eternal. But the queen, hearing strange sounds, entered the nursery one night and saw her child lying in flames. Her scream of terror interrupted the transformation before it could complete, robbing the child of immortality at the very moment it was being granted. Isis, forced to reveal her true form, explained everything. The royal family, realizing a goddess had been living in their household caring for their children, immediately offered her the pillar. It was cut open, the chest extracted, and Isis began her journey home with her husband's body. But she made a fatal mistake. Exhausted from travel, overwhelmed by finally recovering Osiris, she stopped to rest and opened the chest to look upon his face one last time before burial. That moment of tender grief gave Set, monitoring through his own magical surveillance, the opening he needed. He came in the night and stole the body while Isis slept. Then Set, enraged that his crime might be undone, committed an even greater atrocity. He dismembered Osiris's body, cutting it into pieces. The exact number varies between sources. 14 appears most frequently, possibly connected to lunar cycles or Osiris's role as a lunar deity. Other accounts claim 16, still others 42, one for each of Egypt's administrative districts. This variation might not reflect confusion, but rather different traditions emphasizing different symbolic meanings of the dismemberment. Set scattered these pieces across the entire length and breadth of Egypt, from the delta marshlands to the first cataract at Aswan, ensuring geographic distribution so vast that recovery should have been impossible. Each piece was hidden, each location chosen to make discovery as difficult as possible. Most people would have surrendered to despair. The god was not merely dead, but scattered so widely that reassembly seemed beyond even divine capability. Set had escalated from murder to desecration, making his crime permanent and irreversible. But Isis refused to accept defeat. With Nephthys beside her and Anubis guiding them, the son she had raised despite his birth from Osiris and Nephthys' union, she began a second search. They traveled in a boat made of papyrus reeds, visiting every corner of Egypt, following every rumor, investigating every whisper of the sacred. This second journey created a sacred geography that would unite Egypt for millennia. Wherever they found a piece of Osiris, they performed burial rites and established a shrine before continuing. This explains why so many Egyptian cities claimed to possess part of Osiris's body, to be the burial place of his heart or head or limb. The myth sanctified the entire kingdom, making Osiris present everywhere, connecting every region through shared worship. Plutarch preserves one detail that the Egyptians themselves emphasized in their own texts. Isis found all the pieces except one. Osiris's phallus had been thrown into the Nile and consumed by 3 species of fish: the Oxyrhynchus, Phagrus, and Lepidotus. This is why these fish were considered taboo throughout Egyptian history, forbidden food that no Egyptian would willingly eat. Isis, demonstrating magical ability that exceeded normal divine limitations, fashioned a replacement phallus from gold, and through her spells, made it function as well as the original. This detail, which might seem inappropriate to modern sensibilities, reveals something important. The Egyptians weren't squeamish about bodies, sexuality, or the physical reality of death. These were sacred matters, divine concerns that their religion addressed directly and honestly. With all pieces recovered or replicated, Isis was ready to attempt what no one had ever done before: bring the dead back to life. But the resurrection she achieved would be unlike anything the world had ever seen, creating not a return to life, but something entirely new, a third state between life and death that would change Egyptian civilization forever. The first mummy, life from death. What Isis did next would transform human history. She began assembling Osiris's body, piece by piece, wrapping each segment in linen bandages to hold everything together. This was the world's first mummification, the template that every Egyptian burial would follow for 3,000 years. But here's where the myth reveals something profound that scholars are only now fully appreciating. Isis wasn't just preserving a corpse. She was creating something entirely new, inventing a technology, both physical and magical, for reversing death itself. As she worked, she sang incantations of immense power. These weren't simple prayers, but sophisticated magical formulas that could reach into the underworld and call back a departed soul, that could reanimate dead flesh and restore broken bodies. The spells she created became some of the most important texts in Egyptian religion, appearing first in the pyramid texts carved into Old Kingdom tombs around 2400 BCE, then in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, and finally in the New Kingdom's Book of the Dead. Each iteration modified the spells slightly, adapting what Isis had done for Osiris, so that deceased kings, and eventually all Egyptians who could afford it, could hope for the same resurrection. The magic worked, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Osiris didn't return to full life, didn't resume his former existence as Egypt's living king. Instead, he entered a third state, something between life and death that had never existed before. He had breath, but not as the living breathe. He had consciousness, but not as the living know it. He could move and speak and think, but he belonged now to a different realm entirely. He became Lord of the Duat, the underworld, king of the dead rather than king of the living. This transformation wasn't a diminishment, but an elevation to a new kind of power. Every soul that died would eventually come before Osiris for judgment. He would determine who had lived according to Ma'at and deserved eternal life in the blessed field of reeds, and who had embraced chaos and deserved to be devoured by Ammit, suffering the second death of complete annihilation. But before Osiris departed for the underworld, something else happened, something the ancient texts describe with remarkable directness, despite its impossibility. Isis conceived a child with her resurrected husband. The sources don't shy away from the physical reality of this union. The pyramid texts and later funerary literature describe how Isis, through her magic, animated Osiris's body sufficiently for intercourse. The golden phallus she had created functioned as she had designed it to. She transformed herself into a kite, a bird of prey, and hovered over his body, receiving his seed, conceiving the child who would become Horus. This image appeared repeatedly in Egyptian art. Isis as a bird hovering over the mummified Osiris, the moment of conception between the living and the dead, the impossible union that would produce Egypt's future king. The symbolism runs deep, life emerging from death, hope born from tragedy, the future secured despite the murder of the past. Think about what this means theologically. The Egyptians created a myth where a goddess became pregnant through an act of necromancy, where the boundary between life and death proved permeable enough for life to cross back from the other side, long enough to create new life. This wasn't resurrection as later religions would imagine it, not a return to earthly existence. This was something stranger and more profound, a transformation that allowed Osiris to function simultaneously as dead god, ruling the underworld, and as living father, siring an heir. The child Isis carried would be named Horus, and his conception was both biological and magical, natural and supernatural, possible and impossible all at once. He would be born not in a palace, but in hiding, raised in secrecy because Seth, having killed Osiris, would naturally seek to kill Osiris's heir to make his own claim to the throne permanent and unchallengeable. Isis's pregnancy, then, became a race against time. She needed to remain hidden long enough to give birth and raise Horus to maturity, keeping him safe from his murderous uncle while preparing him for the moment when he would emerge to claim his inheritance. The murdered god's son, conceived in an act of magic that blurred every boundary between life and death, would grow up knowing that his father's throne waited for him, if he could survive long enough to claim it. For one brief moment, though, before his descent to the underworld became permanent, Osiris was alive enough to perform one final act. Isis, through her magic and her love, reanimated him sufficiently to conceive a child, to ensure that his line would continue, that his throne would not remain forever usurped by Seth. The exact mechanics of this conception were discreetly left vague in Egyptian texts, though visual representations show Isis in the form of a kite, a bird of prey, hovering over Osiris's mummified body, receiving his seed through magical means. From this union of the living and the dead, of divine magic and murdered god, would come Horus, the avenger, the rightful heir, the one who would eventually reclaim his father's throne and restore Ma'at to Egypt. The conception of Horus and the hidden child. The conception of Horus is one of the most sacred mysteries in Egyptian religion, the moment when life emerges from death, when hope is born from tragedy, when the promise of restoration is made even before vengeance can be contemplated. The ancient texts describe it in language that is simultaneously physical and metaphysical, sexual and spiritual, realistic and utterly fantastic, capturing the paradox of a child conceived between a grieving widow who still walks the earth and a murdered king who has descended to rule the realm of death. Isis, having reassembled Osiris's body and reanimated it through her magical incantations, transforms herself into a kite, a bird of prey associated with mourning and with the goddess's fierce protective nature. She hovers above Osiris's body, creating wind with her wings, breathing life into his still lungs, drawing forth from him the seed that will create their son, even though Osiris himself is dying or already dead, depending on which moment of the story you're focused on. It's an image of tremendous pathos and power, the living trying to draw life from the dead, the devoted wife refusing to let death be the final word, maternal determination overcoming even the laws of nature. The conception completed, Osiris departs permanently to the Duat, taking up his throne in the underworld, becoming the judge of the dead, the lord of eternity, the god who waits at the end of every mortal's journey to determine whether they have lived in accordance with Ma'at and therefore deserve to enter the blessed realm of the dead, or whether they have lived in chaos and injustice and therefore deserve annihilation. His reign in death mirrors his reign in life. As he once judged the living and maintained order among them, now he judges the dead and maintains order in the afterlife. As he once was the ideal king of Egypt, now he is the ideal king of the underworld. But the child Osiris left behind would need years to grow into the strength necessary to challenge Set for the throne. During those years, Isis would have to protect her son from Set's murderous rage while simultaneously preparing him for his destiny, while teaching him everything he would need to know to be not just a king, but a worthy heir to Osiris, a ruler who could restore what had been lost when his father died. Isis fled to the Nile Delta, to the marshlands where papyrus grew thick and tall, creating natural hiding places where a determined mother could conceal her infant son from even the most diligent search. The marshes were liminal spaces, neither fully land nor fully water, neither completely tamed nor completely wild, existing at the boundary between the cultivated black land and the chaotic red land, between order and chaos. They were the perfect place for Isis to hide with her illegitimate heir, raising him in secret, teaching him, protecting him, preparing him for the day when he would be strong enough to claim what was his by right. The young god was called Horus, like his uncle Horus the Elder, but he was distinguished as Horus the Younger, Horus son of Isis, Horus the Avenger. His childhood in the marshes would become the focus of a rich tradition of stories emphasizing his vulnerability, his mother's devotion, and the constant danger that surrounded them both. Set searched ceaselessly for the child, knowing that as long as Osiris's heir lived, his own claim to the throne would be contested. His position as king would remain insecure. One of the most famous stories from Horus's childhood tells how Set sent a scorpion or a serpent, accounts vary, to kill the infant. Isis had left Horus hidden in the marsh while she went to gather food or to perform some errand, trusting that the hiding place was secure enough that she could safely leave him briefly. But Set's spy found the child, and the venomous creature struck, biting or stinging the baby Horus with deadly poison. When Isis returned, she found her son dying, the poison spreading through his small body, and her cries of anguish were so loud and so heartbreaking that they reached the heavens and caught the attention of the sun, god Ra himself. Ra stopped his solar bark in its journey across the sky, halting time itself, and sent Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic, to save the child. Thoth descended to the marsh and recited powerful healing spells, drawing the poison from Horus's body, restoring him to health and life. This story established Horus as the divine patron of healing magic, particularly for children who had been bitten by scorpions or serpents. Throughout Egyptian history, mothers would recite the spells Thoth used to heal Horus, invoking that ancient miracle to protect their own children from venomous creatures. Stone stelae called tipi, showing Horus as a child standing on crocodiles and grasping dangerous animals, were erected throughout Egypt, their inscriptions containing the healing spells, water poured over them, and then drunk, providing magical protection against poison. As Horus grew from infant to child to youth, Isis taught him everything Osiris would have taught him had he lived. She told him stories of his father's reign, of the golden age when Ma'at prevailed and Egypt prospered, of the civilization Osiris had brought to humanity, of the murder that ended all that, of Set's usurpation and the chaos and suffering his rule had brought. She trained him in the arts of kingship, in warfare and justice, in the proper worship of the gods and the proper care of people. She taught him magic, passing on the spells and incantations that were her particular domain, making him a god who combined martial prowess with supernatural power, physical strength with spiritual authority. And she taught him about his destiny. He was Horus, son of Osiris, rightful heir to the throne of Egypt, the one who would restore Ma'at, the one who would avenge his father's murder and end Set's chaotic reign. This was not merely his right, but his sacred duty, not just a political matter, but a cosmic necessity. The balance of the universe required that Osiris's legitimate heir rule Egypt. The very structure of reality depended on the right king sitting on the throne. Everything Isis did, every lesson she taught, every spell she imparted, every story she told, was designed to prepare Horus for the moment when he would stand before the council of gods and demand that Set be removed, and he himself be installed as Egypt's rightful king. That moment was approaching. Horus was reaching maturity, developing into a formidable warrior god, skilled in battle, powerful in magic, righteous in cause. Soon he would emerge from hiding, would challenge Set openly, would begin the long legal and physical battle that would consume decades and would eventually restore order to Egypt. The murder that had shattered the golden age would finally be answered with justice. But that justice would not come easily or quickly. The gods themselves would have to adjudicate the case, and divine justice moves slowly, methodically, carefully, ensuring that the right outcome is reached even if that requires years or decades, or, in this case, 80 years of contentious litigation. The Contendings, 80 years of divine litigation. When Horus finally came of age and emerged from the marshes where Isis had hidden and raised him, he did not simply march up to Set and challenge him to single combat. Divine politics were more complex than that. Set was the sitting king of Egypt, installed on the throne after Osiris's death, ruling for however many years had passed, wielding the authority and power that came with that position. He could not simply be deposed by force without creating chaos equal to the chaos his own usurpation had created. The divine order required process, required justice, required that disputes be resolved through proper channels, even when those disputes were between gods. And so Horus brought his case before the Ennead, the council of 9 great gods of Heliopolis, demanding that they recognize him as his father's legitimate heir, that they remove Set from the throne and install him in Set's place, that they restore Ma'at by ensuring that the right king ruled Egypt. What followed was one of the longest and most contentious trials in all mythology, a legal and personal battle that would last, according to the Contendings of Horus and Seth, preserved in Papyrus Chester Beatty first for 80 years. 80 years, 3 mortal lifetimes. A span of time so long that if the case had involved humans, all the original parties would have been long dead before judgment was finally rendered. But gods do not age as humans age. For them, 80 years was merely a prolonged inconvenience, a tedious but necessary process of ensuring that the right decision was made, that all arguments were heard, that all evidence was considered, that justice was done, even if justice took decades to accomplish. The trial was presided over by the sun god Ra, here called Ra Horakti, Ra Horus of the horizon, in one of his many forms and manifestations. The other gods of the Ennead served as the jury and as witnesses, their votes determining the outcome, their opinions swaying the judgment this way and that as new arguments were presented and new evidence came to light. The trial record, preserved in the Chester Beatty Papyrus, reads at times like a legal transcript, with formal declarations and responses, and at other times like a scandalous tale full of tricks and violence and sexual content that would be considered crude or shocking if we didn't remember that ancient religions were not constrained by later prudishness, that the gods were understood to be powerful and passionate beings whose behavior did not necessarily conform to human moral standards. The arguments on both sides were clear from the start. Horus claimed the throne by right of inheritance. He was Osiris's son, the legitimate heir, the one who should rule according to the principle of patrilineal succession that governed human kingship in Egypt. Set by this logic was a usurper who had stolen what belonged to Horus, and justice required that the theft be reversed and the property returned to its rightful owner. Set, however, had his own arguments, and they were not without merit. He was older than Horus, more experienced, more powerful in battle. He had actually been ruling Egypt. Not always well, perhaps, but he had been ruling, maintaining some semblance of order, even if it was not the perfect mart of Osiris's reign. He was Osiris's brother, making him family, making him someone who could legitimately claim a relationship to the former king. And most importantly, he argued, Horus was too young, too inexperienced, too weak to rule effectively. The throne required strength, required authority, required someone who could defend Egypt against its enemies and maintain order against the constant threat of chaos. Many of the gods initially favored Horus's claim. Isis, of course, argued passionately for her son, using all her rhetorical skill and magical persuasion to sway the other gods to support him. Thoth, the god of wisdom and justice, supported Horus on purely legal grounds, arguing that inheritance law was clear and that primogeniture should be respected. Shu, the god of air, supported Horus. Several other deities agreed that the son should inherit from the father, that Set's usurpation, however long-standing, did not become legitimate merely through persistence. But Ra himself favored Set, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the text. Perhaps he valued experience over youth. Perhaps he feared that giving the throne to Horus would require invalidating Set's entire reign, creating a retroactive chaos that would be worse than accepting the status quo. Perhaps he simply liked Set better, or was influenced by Set's greater age and power. Whatever the reason, Ra's support for Set created a deadlock. The gods could not all agree. The case could not be easily resolved. And so it dragged on, year after year, argument after argument, incident after incident, becoming less and less a legal proceeding, and more a protracted struggle involving tricks, violence, magical contests, and appeals to various higher authorities. At one point, the Ennead decided to consult Neith, the ancient goddess who predated even creation, seeking her wisdom to break the deadlock. Neith's response was unequivocal. Give the throne to Horus, for he is the rightful heir, and compensate Set by giving him 2 foreign goddesses, Anat and Astarte, as wives. But even this divine wisdom from one of the oldest and most respected goddesses failed to settle the matter. Ra still objected. Set still refused to step down, and the trial continued. Many of the incidents recorded in the Contendings involve Set trying to prove his superiority to Horus through various contests and challenges, while Horus and Isis respond by outsmarting Set at every turn. demonstrating that cleverness and justice can overcome brute force and age. In one famous episode, Set and Horus transform themselves into hippopotamuses and submerge themselves in the Nile, agreeing that whoever can remain underwater longer will win the throne. Isis, watching from the shore, cannot bear the thought of her son drowning and throws a harpoon into the water to help him. But her aim is off, and she strikes Horus instead. She retrieves the harpoon and throws again, this time hitting Set. Set cries out, appealing to his sister, reminding her of their shared childhood, their bonds of kinship, their siblinghood. Moved by this appeal, Isis withdraws the harpoon and releases Set. Horus, enraged that his mother would show mercy to his enemy, emerges from the water and decapitates her. This shocking act of violence against his own mother demonstrates that Horus, for all his righteousness, was also capable of rage and injustice, that the hero of the story was not without flaws, that the restoration of Ma'at would require Horus to learn restraint and wisdom, not merely to defeat Set through superior force. The gods are horrified by what Horus has done. Set pursues Horus into the mountains and catches him, gouging out his eyes as punishment for attacking Isis. But the goddess Hathor restores Horus's eyes using gazelle milk, healing him as Isis had been healed after her decapitation, demonstrating the reversibility of divine injuries and the supportive role other goddesses played in helping Isis and Horus in their struggle. Another episode, one that modern readers often find startling or uncomfortable, involves Set attempting to prove his dominance over Horus through sexual violence. Set invites Horus to spend the night with him, perhaps as a gesture of reconciliation, perhaps as a trap. And during the night, Set attempts to rape Horus, seeking to penetrate him and thus establish himself as the dominant male in the relationship, which in Egyptian thought would prove his superior claim to kingship. But Horus, warned by Isis or acting on his own quick thinking, catches Set's semen in his hands rather than allowing it to enter his body. He brings the semen to Isis, who cuts off his hands. They regenerate as divine flesh does, and throws them into the Nile to dispose of the contaminated substance. Then Isis devises a counter-strategy. She causes Horus to produce semen and spreads it on lettuce growing in Set's garden. Set, who regularly eats lettuce from this garden, consumes the lettuce containing Horus's seed, unknowingly ingesting it. When the question of sexual dominance comes before the divine council, Set boasts that he has humiliated Horus by penetrating him. But Thoth calls upon both gods' semen to testify to their location. Set's semen, thrown in the Nile, calls out from the water. Horus's semen, inside Set's body, calls out from Set's forehead, where it emerges as a golden disc, which Thoth takes and places on his own head as a crown. The gods laugh at Set's humiliation. He has been symbolically penetrated and impregnated rather than Horus, and by his own boasting, he has revealed his defeat rather than his victory. This episode, which involves homosexual intercourse and consumption of semen, can seem shocking or inappropriate to modern readers who expect ancient religious texts to maintain a certain decorum. But the Egyptians understood divine sexuality as a potent force that could be manipulated for various purposes, and they were not squeamish about bodily fluids or sexual acts in ways that later cultures would be. The episode demonstrates Set's deviousness and Horus's cleverness, Isis's strategic thinking and magical knowledge. It establishes, in a way the Egyptians found meaningful, that Horus cannot be dominated by Set, that the younger god has the wit and the magical resources to overcome any challenge the older god presents. The Contendings continue through many more episodes and challenges, through appeals to various deities, through battles and transformations and tricks. At various points, Ra grows tired of the whole proceeding and threatens to leave the case unresolved, to let Set keep the throne, simply because deciding otherwise has become too difficult and too contentious. At other points it seems that judgment is about to be rendered in Horus's favor, only for some new complication to arise, some new argument to be presented, some new test to be proposed that delays resolution still further. Eventually, the Ennead decides to write a letter to Osiris himself, to ask the murdered god who he thinks should rule Egypt. Osiris, from his throne in the underworld, responds with devastating clarity and with a barely concealed threat. Horus is his son and rightful heir. Justice demands that Horus rule. And furthermore, Osiris controls the messengers of death, who could come even for gods if Osiris willed it. He reminds the Ennead that every one of them will someday die and come to his realm, where he will judge them, where his opinion of their behavior in life will determine their fate in death. He is subtle about this, but the meaning is clear. Decide justly in favor of Horus, or face Osiris's wrath when you enter his domain. This intervention from the underworld proves decisive. The gods, convinced by Osiris's arguments and perhaps intimidated by his implied threats, render their final judgment. Horus is declared the rightful king of Egypt. Set must step down and yield the throne. Ma'at will be restored with the right king ruling the land. After 80 years of contention, the case is finally resolved. The triumph of Ma'at, order restored. The Contendings ended not with Horus killing Set, but with Set's forcible removal from the throne and banishment to the desert, back to the red land that had been his original inheritance, away from the fertile black land he had ruled so poorly. Some versions say that Set accepted this judgment, acknowledging Horus's right to rule. Others say that Set had to be physically subdued, that Horus and other gods bound him and dragged him from the throne. Others still say that Set was given a consolation role, becoming the god who stands at the prow of Ra's solar bark and fights off Apophis, the chaos serpent who tries to swallow the sun each night, transforming Set from villain into necessary, defender, from chaos bringer into chaos preventer, from destroyer of Ma'at into protector of cosmic order. This last version reflects a deep Egyptian understanding that chaos and order are not simple opposites where one must be entirely eliminated for the other to prevail, but rather necessary complements that must be balanced against each other. Egypt needed the desert and the god who ruled it. Egypt needed Set's strength and ferocity, his violence and his power, but these needed to be directed outward against external threats rather than inward against Egypt's own gods and people. Set could not be destroyed or fully vanquished because the force he represented was eternal and essential. He could only be constrained, redirected, controlled. Horus ascended to his father's throne, becoming king of Egypt, the living manifestation of divine kingship. The god who ruled the black land as Set ruled the red land. The sky god who watched over his people from above, as his father watched over the dead from below. Isis, who had protected and prepared him through his childhood and youth, who had argued his case before the gods and aided him in his battles against Set, now became the divine model of the Queen Mother, the powerful woman behind the throne whose wisdom and magic supported the king's rule. Osiris remained in the Duat, enthroned as king of the dead, judging every soul that entered his realm, determining who had lived according to Ma'at, and therefore deserved eternal life in the blessed realm of the dead, and who had lived in chaos and injustice, and therefore deserved to be devoured by Ammit, the demon who destroyed those who failed the weighing of the heart. Every Egyptian would eventually stand before Osiris, their heart weighed against Ma'at's feather of truth, their deeds recited by Thoth, who recorded everything, their fate decided by the god who had himself died and been resurrected, who knew what death meant, who could judge with perfect understanding because he had experienced what he was judging others for. The restoration of Horus to the throne did not mean the return of the Golden Age exactly as it had been. The world had been changed by Osiris's murder, by Set's chaotic reign, by the decades of contention and violence. Innocence, if gods could be said to have innocence, had been lost. The perfect harmony of the early time could never be fully recovered. But Ma'at was restored in principle, if not in perfect execution. The rightful king ruled. Justice prevailed. Order was maintained against the constant threat of chaos. This resolution became the foundation of Egyptian political theology for the entire duration of pharaonic civilization. Every king who ruled Egypt was understood to be the living Horus, the son of the previous king, who was now an Osiris, ruling on earth as his father ruled in the underworld. Coronation rituals and iconography constantly reinforced this identification. The king wore the crowns of Horus. He performed rituals associated with Horus's victory over Set. He was understood to restore Ma'at, just as Horus had restored it after Set's chaotic reign. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris, joining his divine predecessor in the underworld, judging the dead as Osiris judged them. His son, ascending to the throne, became the new Horus, defending his father's legacy, maintaining Ma'at, fighting against the forces of chaos, both literal and metaphorical. The cycle repeated endlessly, each generation recapitulating the mythic pattern established by Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus in the time before time, when gods ruled Egypt and established the templates that mortals would follow forever after. The myth explained everything. It explained why kings ruled and why the succession passed from father to son. It explained why mothers had power and why maternal loyalty was sacred. It explained why treachery and murder were the greatest crimes, why chaos had to be fought constantly, why eternal vigilance was the price of civilization. It explained why the dead could hope for resurrection if they were properly mourned and properly buried. It explained why Egypt itself was sacred, every nome sanctified by containing a piece of Osiris's body, every temple celebrating some aspect of the divine family's story, every festival reenacting some episode from the great myth. The triumph of Ma'at was never final or complete. It had to be maintained generation after generation, threatened constantly by internal treachery and external invasion, by bad kings and corrupt officials, by famine and disease, and all the other manifestations of Isvat, chaos, and disorder. But the myth promised that Ma'at could always be restored if the right king sat on the throne, if the right rituals were performed, if the people lived according to truth and justice. The murder had happened. The chaos had been real. But the restoration had happened too, and it could happen again whenever Egypt needed it. Whenever the people called on Horus to defend them, and on Isis to protect them, and on Osiris to judge justly and maintain order, even in death. The story of Osiris's murder and Horus's triumph became Egypt's eternal story, retold in every temple, reenacted in every festival, memorialized in every tomb. It was not just a myth, but a living reality, a pattern that repeated in every generation, a promise that however dark things became, however chaotic the world seemed, Ma'at could be restored. Order could triumph. Justice could prevail. The rightful heir would always eventually claim his throne, and death itself could be overcome through love and magic and proper ritual. These were the truths the myth taught, and they sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. Echoes through eternity. Cultural impact. The Osiris myth was not simply a story the Egyptians told. It was the story, the narrative that undergirded their entire civilization, that shaped their understanding of kingship and death, of justice and family, of order and chaos. Its influence can be traced through virtually every aspect of Egyptian culture, from the highest theology to the most practical funerary customs, from monumental architecture to tiny protective amulets, from royal rituals that only pharaohs could perform to domestic practices that every Egyptian family observed. Most obviously and importantly, the myth shaped Egyptian funerary practices in ways both profound and practical. When Isis embalmed Osiris, wrapping his reassembled body in linen bandages, reciting spells to restore him to life, she created the template that all future Egyptian burials would follow. Mummification, that distinctive Egyptian practice that continues to fascinate people today, was understood as imitating what Isis did for Osiris, as giving the deceased the same chance at resurrection that Osiris had received through his wife's devotion and magical skill. The process was elaborate and expensive, affordable in its complete form only by royalty and the wealthy, though less extensive versions became available to more people over time as the democratization of the afterlife progressed. The body was first washed and purified. Then the internal organs were removed through an incision in the side, recalling either how Set cut open Osiris's body or how Set himself tore open Nut's side at his own birth. The brain was extracted through the nose using hooks, for the Egyptians did not recognize the brain as important and simply discarded it. But the heart was left in place, for the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion, the part of the person that would be weighed in judgment before Osiris. The organs that were removed were placed in canopic jars, each protected by a different deity. Sons of Horus who guarded the viscera of the dead, as Horus had guarded his father's integrity. The body itself was packed in natron salt for 40 days to dry it out, preventing decay. Then it was wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages, with amulets and protective spells inserted between the layers, with resin poured over the wrappings to seal them. The wrapped mummy was placed in a coffin, often anthropoid in shape, painted and decorated with images of protective deities and with excerpts from funerary texts. The coffin might then be placed inside additional coffins, nested like Russian dolls, each providing another layer of protection, another barrier against the dangers the deceased would face. Throughout this process, priests wearing masks representing Anubis, the god of embalming who had helped Isis prepare Osiris's body, performed the rituals, recited the spells, ensured that everything was done correctly according to ancient tradition. The family of the deceased mourned, and professional mourners were hired to enhance the lamentation. Women who would tear their clothes and dishevel their hair and wail and beat their breasts just as Isis and Nephthys had mourned for Osiris. The mourning was not mere emotional expression, but magical action, a necessary component of the transformation the deceased was undergoing, a way of attracting the attention of the gods and ensuring they would help guide the soul to the afterlife. After burial, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, touching the mummy's mouth with special tools to restore the deceased's ability to eat and drink and speak in the afterlife, recalling how Isis's magic had restored Osiris's functions. Offerings of food and drink were left at the tomb, not because the physical substance was needed, but because the Ka, the life force, could consume the spiritual essence of the offerings. These offerings would need to be renewed regularly, which is why wealthy Egyptians endowed perpetual mortuary cults, establishing funds to ensure that priests would continue making offerings at their tombs for eternity, or at least for as long as the endowments lasted and the kingdom stood. The deceased was now ready to begin the journey through the Duat, the underworld, following the path Osiris had taken, facing the dangers and challenges Osiris had faced, eventually arriving at the Hall of Two Truths, where Osiris sat in judgment. The heart of the deceased would be weighed against Maat's feather of truth. If the heart was heavy with sin, weighed down by lies and injustice and chaos, it would outweigh the feather and be devoured by Amit. The deceased would cease to exist, suffering what Egyptians called the second death, final and irreversible annihilation. But if the heart was light, if the deceased had lived in accordance with Ma'at, the scales would balance, Osiris would judge favorably, and the deceased would be welcomed into the blessed realm, allowed to live eternally in the field of reeds, a paradise that mirrored the best aspects of earthly life, but without its sufferings and limitations. Every step of this process, from the initial embalming to the final judgment, was understood as following the pattern established by Osiris's death and resurrection. The deceased was becoming an Osiris, was recapitulating the god's journey, was hoping for the same restoration that Isis had achieved for her husband. The pyramid texts and later funerary texts are filled with spells identifying the deceased with Osiris, declaring, "You are Osiris," or even more directly, "I am Osiris," claiming the god's identity and therefore his fate, insisting that as Osiris lived again, so too would the deceased live again. This was not originally available to everyone. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh was definitively said to become Osiris after death. Other people might have various fates in the afterlife, but the full Osirian resurrection was a royal prerogative, part of what made the king divine. But over time, this began to change, first extending to royal family members, then to high officials, then gradually to anyone who could afford the proper funerary preparations. By the New Kingdom, any Egyptian with sufficient resources could aspire to become an Osiris, could hope for the resurrection and eternal life that had once been reserved only for kings. This democratization of the afterlife was one of the most significant religious developments in Egyptian history, transforming Osiris from a royal deity into a universal savior figure, a god whose death and resurrection offered hope to all humanity, not just to the elite few. The myth also shaped kingship ideology in fundamental ways. Every pharaoh who ruled Egypt was understood to be the living Horus, the god who had successfully reclaimed his father's throne, who maintained Ma'at against the constant threat of chaos, who defended Egypt against its enemies, both human and supernatural. Coronation ceremonies and royal rituals constantly reinforced this identification. The king wore the distinctive crowns associated with Horus. He was given the throne names and titles that linked him to the divine kingship. He performed rituals that recapitulated Horus's victory over Seth, demonstrating that he too could overcome chaos and establish order. When a pharaoh died, he ceased to be the living Horus and became Osiris instead, departing to rule the underworld as Osiris ruled it, judging the dead as Osiris judged them. His son, succeeding to the throne, became the new Horus, the new defender of Ma'at, continuing the eternal pattern. This system provided ideological justification for patrilineal succession, explaining why the throne passed from father to son rather than through some other mechanism. It also emphasized the sacred nature of kingship, the idea that the pharaoh was not simply a powerful human, but a god incarnate, worthy of worship and absolute obedience. Royal iconography throughout Egyptian history depicted this relationship explicitly. Horus was shown protecting the king, hovering above him in falcon form or standing behind him with protective wings spread. The king was shown performing rituals before statues of Osiris, honoring his divine predecessor. Temple walls were carved with scenes from the Osiris myth, reminding viewers of the eternal pattern, of how order had been restored after chaos, of how the rightful heir always eventually triumphed. Major temple complexes throughout Egypt were dedicated to members of the divine family. Abydos, where Osiris's head was supposedly buried, became the most sacred pilgrimage site in Egypt, a place where people longed to be buried, so they could rest near the god. An annual festival there reenacted Osiris's death and resurrection, with priests playing the roles of various gods, with ritual battles between Horus's followers and Seth's followers, with processions carrying a statue of Osiris through the streets. Everyone who could afford it made the pilgrimage to Abydos at least once, believing that participation in the rituals and proximity to Osiris's tomb would improve their chances of achieving resurrection after death. The temple at Philae, on an island in the Nile near Aswan, was dedicated to Isis and became one of the last functioning pagan temples in the ancient world, continuing its rituals into the 6th century CE, long after Christianity had become the dominant religion of Egypt. Pilgrims came there to honor the great goddess, to benefit from her protective power, to ask her intercession with Osiris on behalf of their dead relatives. The island itself was considered sacred, off-limits to all except priests, except during specific festival days. Temples to Horus existed throughout Egypt, but particularly at Edfu, where one of the best-preserved ancient Egyptian temples still stands today. Its walls are covered with detailed inscriptions describing the Contendings, the battles between Horus and Set, the eventual triumph of order over chaos. The annual festival there involved dramatic performances of these battles, with priests and participants dressed as gods and demons, with ritual combats and magical displays that brought the ancient myth to vibrant life for the assembled crowds. Even in daily life, away from temples and royal courts, the Osiris myth shaped Egyptian culture and consciousness. Protective amulets frequently depicted members of the divine family. The Djed pillar, representing Osiris's spine, symbolized stability and endurance. The Tayet knot, representing Isis's protective powers, was called the blood of Isis and protected women and children. The eye of Horus, the Wadjet, represented healing and wholeness, recalling how Horus's eye was injured by Set and then restored by Hathor or Thoth, depending on the version. These amulets were worn by living Egyptians for protection and placed in tombs with the dead to aid them in the afterlife. The calendar itself was organized around festivals commemorating events from the myth. The Koyak festival in the 4th month of the inundation season reenacted Osiris's death, burial, and resurrection, with priests creating Osiris beds, shallow containers shaped like the god's body, filled with Nile silt and planted with grain. As the grain sprouted and grew, it symbolized Osiris's resurrection, demonstrating visually the connection between the god's myth and the agricultural cycle, between death and rebirth, between the apparent ending of life and its miraculous renewal. The beautiful festival of the valley, held during the 2nd month of the harvest season, saw the cult statue of Amun-Ra ferried across the Nile from Karnak Temple to visit the mortuary temples on the West Bank. Families would visit their relatives' tombs, would feast with the dead, would celebrate the continued existence of their loved ones in the afterlife. The festival reinforced the belief that death was not an ending, that the deceased continued to exist and could still participate in family celebrations, that the boundary between living and dead was permeable and communication was possible. These festivals and rituals, this art and architecture, these amulets and beliefs all stemmed from the central myth of Osiris's death and resurrection. The story was not something that happened once in the distant past and was then finished. It was eternally present, constantly being reenacted, perpetually shaping how Egyptians understood their world and their place in it. The murder that shaped Egypt did so not as a historical event, but as a living mythic reality, as a pattern that repeated in every generation, as a truth that every Egyptian internalized and lived by. The sacred symbolism beyond its obvious religious and political significance, the Osiris myth functioned as a complex symbolic system that allowed the Egyptians to understand and articulate truths about nature, about human experience, about the cosmos itself. Modern scholars have identified multiple layers of meaning in the myth, multiple symbolic registers on which it operated simultaneously, each adding depth and richness to the story. Most obviously, the myth encodes the agricultural cycle that was fundamental to Egyptian life and civilization. Egypt was, in the famous phrase of Herodotus, the gift of the Nile. The river's annual flood, arriving with remarkable regularity each summer, was the single most important fact of Egyptian existence. The flood brought water that irrigated the fields and silt that enriched the soil, making agriculture possible in what would otherwise have been desert. When the flood came at the right time and at the right level, neither too high nor too low, Egypt prospered. When the flood failed or was excessive, famine and disaster followed. The Egyptians connected this natural cycle with Osiris in multiple ways. Some traditions said the Nile's flood was caused by Isis's tears as she mourned her murdered husband, her grief so great that it manifested as the rising waters that covered the land. Others said that Osiris himself was the Nile, or the inundation, that his death represented the dry season when the river was low, and his resurrection represented the flood season when the river rose and life returned to the land. The grain that sprouted from the earth after the flood was Osiris too, dying when it was cut at harvest, only to return when the seeds were planted again, creating an endless cycle of death and rebirth that mirrored the god's own story. This agricultural symbolism was not mere metaphor. For the Egyptians, Osiris really was present in the grain, really did die with the harvest and revive with the planting. The Osiris beds mentioned earlier, those grain-filled containers shaped like the god's body, made this connection explicit and visual. As the grain sprouted and grew, observers could literally see Osiris coming back to life, could witness the resurrection in vegetable form, could understand through observation what they believed through faith. The myth also symbolized the cycle of day and night, particularly in versions that emphasized Osiris's solar aspects and his connection with Ra. The sun's journey across the sky during the day represented Ra's reign and Horus's dominion. The sun's descent below the western horizon and its journey through the underworld during the night represented Osiris's realm, the time when the dead god's power was ascendant. The sun's reappearance in the east each dawn represented resurrection, the triumph of life over death, the eternal return that guaranteed that darkness would never be final, that death would never have the last word. On a more abstract level, the myth embodied the fundamental Egyptian concept of Ma'at versus Isfet, order versus chaos, truth versus lies, justice versus injustice. Ma'at was the principle of cosmic and social order, the right arrangement of things, the way reality was supposed to function when everything was operating correctly. It encompassed concepts that modern languages separate into different categories: truth, justice, righteousness, balance, harmony, proper social relations, correct ritual performance, and the fundamental structure of reality itself. Ma'at was simultaneously a goddess, a principle, and a practice, something the gods maintained in the cosmos and humans maintained in society. Isfet was Ma'at's opposite and enemy, the force of disorder and chaos, of lies and injustice, of violence and confusion. But Isfet was not simply evil in a moral sense. It was ontological disruption, the breakdown of the structures that made existence possible, the intrusion of chaos into order. Set personified Isfet in the myth. When he murdered Osiris, he did not just commit a crime. He fractured reality itself, creating a rupture in Ma'at that threatened to spiral out of control, to drag everything back into the primordial chaos of none from which creation had emerged. Horus's eventual victory over Seth and his restoration to the throne represented the triumph of Ma'at over Isfet, the repair of the rupture, the restoration of right order. but it was not a final triumph. The myth made clear that the struggle between Ma'at and Isfet was eternal, that chaos was always threatening, that order required constant maintenance and defense. Set was not destroyed, but only constrained. He remained necessary, continued to exist, would always pose a threat that required vigilance and effort to contain. This understanding had profound implications for Egyptian culture and ethics. Every Egyptian was called to uphold Me'at in their own life, to live according to truth and justice, to maintain right relations with others, to resist the pull toward chaos and selfishness. The negative confession that the deceased would recite before Osiris listed dozens of sins they claimed not to have committed, acts that would have violated Ma'at. I have not killed. I have not commanded to kill. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. I have not caused tears. I have not committed adultery. I have not lied. I have not been angry without cause. To live in accordance with Ma'at was to participate in the cosmic order, to align oneself with the gods, to earn the right to resurrection after death. Modern scholars, particularly those working in the early 20th century, also interpreted the Osiris myth through the lens of the dying and rising god pattern that James Frazer popularized in his massive work, The Golden Bough. Frazer argued that many ancient cultures had myths about gods who died and were resurrected, gods who embodied the annual cycle of vegetation, of harvest and planting, of winter death and spring rebirth. He included Osiris alongside figures like Attis, Adonis, Tammuz, and Dionysus in this category, suggesting that these myths all served similar functions in their respective cultures. All helped people understand and relate to the natural cycles their survival depended on. Later scholars have critiqued Frazer's approach as too reductionist, as ignoring the specific cultural contexts and distinct meanings of different myths, as imposing a single interpretive framework on diverse phenomena. But the basic observation remains valid. The Osiris myth clearly connects with agricultural and natural cycles, clearly uses the god's death and resurrection to explain and give meaning to patterns the Egyptians observed in the world around them. Whether or not Osiris fits neatly into a universal dying and rising god category, he certainly functioned that way in Egyptian culture, linking divine mythology with seasonal reality, making the sacred and the natural mutually illuminating. The myth also operated on deeply psychological and emotional levels, addressing universal human concerns about death, grief, love, family, and justice. The story of Isis's desperate search for her murdered husband, her refusal to accept his death as final, her determination to resurrect him through love and magic, spoke to something profound in the human experience. Who has not wished they could bring back a lost loved one? Who has not felt that grief so intense it seems like it should be able to reverse death itself? Who has not longed for the kind of love so powerful that not even the grave can contain it? The story made those impossible wishes possible in the realm of myth, and therefore, for the Egyptians, possible in reality through proper ritual. If Isis could resurrect Osiris, then properly performed funerary rites could resurrect the deceased. If love and magic could overcome death for the gods, then love and magic could overcome death for humans too. The myth offered hope in the face of humanity's ultimate terror, offered a way to transform the finality of death into a temporary transition, offered a vision of continued existence and eventual reunion with lost loved ones in a blessed afterlife. The myth also explored themes of betrayal, vengeance, and justice that remain relevant across all cultures and eras. Set's murder of his brother, motivated by jealousy and ambition, represents the ultimate family betrayal, the violation of bonds that should be sacred. and inviolable. His usurpation of the throne represents injustice writ large, the triumph of might over right, of chaos over order. Horus's long struggle to reclaim his inheritance represents the difficult, uncertain process of achieving justice, the reality that righteousness does not automatically triumph, that restoring order requires persistence, cleverness, and support from others. The myth acknowledged that justice might take decades to achieve, that the legal process might be long and contentious, that even divine justice did not come quickly or easily. But it also promised that justice would eventually prevail, that the rightful heir would eventually claim his throne, that patience and perseverance would be rewarded. This was a powerful message in a culture that valued social stability and proper order, that believed deeply in the importance of maintaining ma'at despite constant challenges and threats. Different scholars and different traditions have emphasized different aspects of the myth, have found different meanings and different lessons in the story. Some have focused on its political dimensions, its justification for monarchy and patrilineal succession. Some have emphasized its ritual dimensions, its centrality to funerary practices and agricultural festivals. Some have explored its psychological dimensions, its archetypal patterns of death and rebirth, betrayal and revenge, grief and hope. Some have investigated its connections with other ancient myths, looking for shared patterns and influences. The hidden truth, what the myth really reveals. But here's something most people miss, something that changes everything once you see it. We've been calling this the murder that shaped Egypt. But was it really a murder in the way we understand that word? Or was it something else entirely? Something the ancient Egyptians understood, but that gets lost in translation, in time, in our modern assumptions about what myths are supposed to mean? Look again at what actually happens in the story. Set kills Osiris. That's murder, clear and simple. But then Osiris doesn't just die. He transforms into something more powerful than he was before. He becomes Lord of the Afterlife, the judge who determines every soul's eternal fate, the god that every Egyptian, from pharaoh to peasant, would eventually stand before. In death, Osiris gained a kingdom larger than Egypt itself, a realm that included every human who ever lived or would live. Set thought he was eliminating his rival. Instead, he elevated Osiris to a position of power that transcended earthly kingship entirely. The murder that was supposed to end Osiris's influence actually made him eternal, made him necessary, made him the one inescapable truth that every Egyptian had to confront, that death comes for everyone, and when it does, you face Osiris. But the twist goes deeper. Remember how Set was banished to the desert, but then given the role of defending Ra's solar bark against Apophis, the chaos serpent. Set, the embodiment of chaos and violence, became essential to maintaining cosmic order. His very nature, the destructive force that made him capable of murdering his brother, was precisely what made him capable of fighting off the serpent that tried to destroy the sun every night. The Egyptians were telling us something profound. Chaos and order aren't opposites that need to be separated. They're complementary forces that need to be balanced. Set couldn't be destroyed because the force he represented was necessary. Violence, aggression, the capacity for destruction, these aren't simply evil. They're powers that can protect or destroy depending on how they're directed. And here's the final revelation, the one that changes everything. Osiris had to die to become what he was meant to be. His golden reign as living king was magnificent, yes, but it was also finite, limited to one time and place. His death and resurrection transformed him into something eternal. Every mummification ritual, every funeral, every judgment of the dead, all of these made Osiris present and active throughout Egyptian history in a way that living kingship never could have achieved. What if the whole point wasn't that murder is terrible, though it is, but that death itself is necessary? That transformation requires destruction, that endings enable new beginnings, that what looks like tragedy might actually be the doorway to transcendence? The Egyptians didn't shy away from death. They didn't pretend it wasn't real or wasn't frightening, but they refused to see it as the end. They created an entire civilization built on the belief that death was transformation, that proper ritual could ensure that transformation led to resurrection, that love, Isis's fierce, determined, magical love, could bridge the gap between life and death and bring forth new life from the corpse of the old. Every pharaoh who died became Osiris. Every pharaoh who ascended became Horus. Every son avenging his father reenacted the central myth. But this wasn't just royal theater. This was the fundamental pattern the Egyptians saw operating in reality itself. The old must die for the new to be born. The father must give way to the son. Death feeds life in an endless cycle that spirals upward rather than simply repeating. The murder that shaped Egypt wasn't ultimately about murder at all. It was about transformation. It was about how endings create beginnings. It was about how loss teaches us what matters. It was about how the worst thing that can happen, the death of the beloved, the destruction of order, the triumph of chaos, can be survived, overcome, and transformed into something that creates meaning for millennia. Set murdered Osiris, Isis resurrected him, Horus reclaimed the throne, and in the space between these events, the Egyptians found a way to confront mortality that sustained one of humanity's greatest civilizations for 3,000 years. They found a way to look death in the eye and say, "We know you're coming, we know you're inevitable, but we also know you're not the end. You're just transformation." And we have rituals for that. The story kept changing across those 3,000 years because each generation found new meanings in it, new relevance, new truths that spoke to their particular moment. The fragmentary references in the pyramid texts became elaborate narratives in later sources because the myth was alive, growing, transforming. Just like Osiris himself, just like Egypt itself, just like every person who heard the story and found in it not just ancient history, but present truth. And that's why this murder shaped Egypt more than any historical event ever could. Because it wasn't just a story about something that happened once. It was a story about something that keeps happening, that's happening right now as you listen to these words, that will keep happening as long as people are born and die and wonder what it all means. The murder of Osiris is every death. His resurrection is every hope that death isn't final. Isis's search is every act of love that refuses to accept loss. Horus's triumph is every victory of justice delayed, but not denied. The oldest religious texts ever written hide a secret: that death is transformation, that love is stronger than death, that chaos and order need each other, and that the stories we tell about endings are really stories about beginnings. The Egyptians knew this. They wrote it down. They lived it. They built pyramids to prove it. They wrapped their dead in linen and sent them to meet Osiris with spells carved on their coffins and prayers on their lips. And for 3,000 years, those who believed didn't just survive death, they transcended it, joining Osiris in the field of reeds, eternal and blessed, transformed by the murder that wasn't really murder at all, but the doorway to something greater than mortal life could ever achieve. All these approaches have validity because the myth itself is rich and multifaceted enough to support multiple interpretations, to offer different meanings to different audiences, to function on multiple levels simultaneously. This is what made it such a powerful and enduring story, why it could remain central to Egyptian culture for 3 millennia, why it continued to be told and retold, elaborated and modified, celebrated and commemorated generation after generation, without ever being exhausted or depleted of meaning. The murder that shaped Egypt was infinitely meaningful because it addressed fundamental questions about life and death, order and chaos, justice and injustice, love and loss, questions that every human culture must confront, questions that never find final answers but only provisional understandings that must be continually renewed and reimagined. Legacy and conclusion. The story of Osiris, Isis, and Set did not end with ancient Egypt. The myth's influence spread far beyond the Nile Valley, carried by trade and conquest, transformed by other cultures who encountered Egyptian religion and found in it something compelling, something worth adapting to their own contexts and needs. During the Greco-Roman period, as Egypt came under first Greek and then Roman rule, Egyptian religion underwent significant transformations while retaining its essential character. The Greek rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty, seeking to bridge Egyptian and Greek cultures, promoted the worship of Serapis, a syncretic deity who combined aspects of Osiris, Apis the sacred bull, and Greek gods like Zeus and Hades. Serapis worship spread throughout the Hellenistic world, establishing temples in major Greek cities, attracting devotees who found in this Egyptian import something missing from their own religious traditions. But it was Isis who truly became a universal deity, spreading far beyond Egypt to become one of the most widely worshipped goddesses in the Roman Empire. Her mystery cult, drawing on her mythological role as the devoted wife who resurrected her husband and the protective mother who raised and defended her child, appealed to people throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Temples to Isis were established in Greece, Rome, Gaul, Britain, and even as far as Afghanistan. Her worship crossed cultural boundaries in ways that few other ancient religions managed, offering a powerful combination of emotional appeal, promise of salvation, and elaborate rituals that gave participants a sense of direct connection with the divine. The Isis mystery cult likely influenced early Christianity in various ways, though the exact nature and extent of that influence remains debated among scholars. Both featured a divine figure who died and was resurrected, offering hope of eternal life to believers. Both emphasized the importance of proper ritual performance. Both had powerful feminine figures, Isis in Egyptian religion and Mary in Christianity, associated with compassion, protection, and intercession with male divine figures. Some scholars have suggested that early Christian art depicting Mary nursing the infant Jesus may have been influenced by Egyptian images of Isis nursing the infant Horus, though direct borrowing is difficult to prove definitively. What we can say with certainty is that the Osiris myth provided one of the ancient world's most fully developed theological systems for confronting and overcoming death, for promising resurrection and eternal life, for making sense of suffering and injustice through a cosmic drama that played out in mythological time but had implications for all subsequent time. When Christianity emerged in the Roman world as a religion promising resurrection and eternal life through the death and resurrection of a divine figure, it entered a cultural context where such ideas already had currency, where the dying and rising God pattern already made sense to many people, where the promise of overcoming death already had a language and an imagery that could be adapted to new purposes. Even after the Christianization of Egypt in the early centuries CE, elements of the Osiris myth persisted in folk beliefs and practices. Transformed and reinterpreted, but recognizably continuous with ancient traditions. The Coptic Church, Egypt's indigenous Christian denomination, retained certain elements of ancient Egyptian liturgy and religious sensibility even as it fully embraced Christian theology. The annual Nile flood, no longer attributed to Osiris or Isis's tears, but still recognized as central to Egyptian life, continued to be celebrated with festivals and rituals that maintained connections. Sometimes explicit, sometimes unconscious, with ancient precedents. In modern times, the Osiris myth has been rediscovered and reinterpreted by scholars, artists, writers, and spiritual seekers. The decipherment of hieroglyphics in the 19th century made ancient Egyptian texts accessible to modern readers for the first time in over 1,000 years, allowing scholars to read the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, and other sources in the original Egyptian rather than relying on Greek and Roman interpretations. This sparked enormous interest in Egyptian religion and mythology, influencing art, literature, occultism, and popular culture in ways that continue to the present. Modern neo-pagan movements, particularly those focused on Egyptian religion, have revived worship of Isis, Osiris, and other Egyptian deities, adapting ancient practices to contemporary contexts, finding in these ancient gods and their myths something that speaks to present-day spiritual needs and concerns. These modern practitioners are not attempting to simply recreate ancient religion exactly as it was, which would be impossible given gaps in knowledge and radical differences in cultural context. Instead, they're engaging with Egyptian mythology as a living tradition, as something that can continue to evolve and generate meaning for new generations of believers. The myth also remains important in academic contexts, studied by Egyptologists, historians of religion, anthropologists, and scholars in various other disciplines as an example of how myths function in culture, how stories shape worldviews, how narratives help people make sense of existence and confront fundamental questions about life and death. The story of Osiris, Isis, and Seth continues to teach us about ancient Egyptian culture, about the religious dimensions of human experience, about the power of narrative to create meaning and establish values. But perhaps most fundamentally, the myth continues to resonate because it addresses concerns that remain relevant regardless of historical period or cultural context. Every human society must confront death and develop ways of understanding it, coping with it, maintaining hope in its face. Every society must deal with injustice and violence, must find ways to restore order when disorder threatens, must balance the competing claims of different individuals and factions. Every society must transmit power from one generation to the next, must establish mechanisms for legitimate succession, must deal with the challenges of transition. The Osiris myth offered the Egyptians a way of thinking about all these issues, a narrative framework that made sense of difficult realities, that transformed death from absolute ending into temporary transition, that promised justice even when justice was delayed, that made cosmic sense of the political and social structures that organized Egyptian life. It was not simply a story, but a complete worldview, not just entertainment but profound theology, not merely mythological, but fundamentally real in ways that shaped how millions of people over thousands of years understood their existence and organized their lives. As you rest now, as sleep approaches, consider what makes a story powerful enough to sustain a civilization for 3 millennia. Consider how a narrative about murder and resurrection, about loyalty and betrayal, about justice delayed but ultimately achieved, could speak so deeply to human concerns that it would be told and retold, enacted and commemorated, believed and lived for longer than most nations have existed. The murder that shaped Egypt shaped it, because the story was bigger than any individual telling, because it touched something essential about human experience, because it offered answers to questions that never stop being asked. The Nile still floods, though now controlled by dams and irrigation systems, rather than arriving with the unpredictable natural rhythm that the ancient Egyptians experienced and attributed to Osiris's power. The pyramids and temples still stand, their walls still covered with hieroglyphics telling and retelling the ancient story, though now they're archaeological sites and tourist attractions rather than functioning religious centers. Egypt itself continues as a nation, though transformed beyond anything the ancient Egyptians could have imagined, its modern inhabitants no longer worshipping the gods of their ancestors, but maintaining a connection with that ancient past through culture and history, and the simple fact of continuing to live in the same land, along the same river. And the myth endures, known to millions who have never visited Egypt, who will never read the pyramid texts or walk through the temple at Abydos, but who nonetheless know that once there was a god named Osiris who was murdered by his brother Seth and resurrected by his wife Isis, and that this story, this ancient Egyptian story, somehow still matters, still has something to teach us about death and life, about justice and chaos, about love strong enough to overcome even the ultimate separation. Rest well, knowing that 3,000 years ago, people looked at the same sky you see, wondered about the same eternal questions you wonder about, and found in the story of Osiris a truth that sustained them. That same truth, adapted and transformed but still recognizable, still powerful, can sustain us still. The murder that shaped Egypt shaped it so completely, so fundamentally, that its echoes continue to the present day, teaching us that death need not be final, that justice, though delayed, can prevail, and that love, the love Isis bore for Osiris, the love that refused to accept murder as the last word, remains the most powerful force in the universe, stronger than death, more enduring than stone, eternal as the stars. Sleep well, dream of the Nile and the desert, of gods who walked the earth, of a story that never ends because it keeps being retold, keeps finding new meanings, keeps teaching new lessons to each generation that encounters it. The murder happened in mythical time, but echoes through all time. The restoration came after 80 years, but promised restoration whenever it was needed. And the truth revealed in the myth, about death and life, about chaos and order, about the eternal struggle to maintain Ma'at in a world that constantly threatens to collapse into Isfet. That truth remains as valid today as it was when the pyramid texts were first carved into stone, when the priests first recited the spells, when the story first took the form that would shape a civilization and influence the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the myth of Osiris, Isis, and Set. If you enjoyed this exploration of Egyptian mythology, please subscribe to Sleepable Mythology and let us know in the comments which ancient myth you'd like us to explore next. Rest well, knowing that the stories that sustained ancient civilizations can still speak to us today, can still teach us about the eternal questions that every generation must face. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the wisdom of the ages.